It was 9:17 p.m. on a quiet Tuesday in early March when Harold Jennings stood barefoot in the kitchen of his modest home in Asheville, North Carolina. The wind tapped gently at the window panes like an old friend asking to come in, but Harold paid it no mind. He was focused. The kettle whistled low as steam curled lazily into the air, carrying with it the scent of chamomile, lemon balm, and a dash of turmeric. This was his nightly ritual. Not just tea, but the first step in what he called his reset routine. Harold had turned 63 3 months ago, and for most of his life, he had never paid much attention to the idea of sharpening the mind. He had worked in the Postal Service for 35 years, retired just before Christmas last year, and had imagined retirement would be a blend of relaxation, travel, and catching up on books. But something strange happened instead. The first month of retirement felt like a vacation. The second month felt like floating in space. And by the third, Harold began to notice the edges of his thoughts weren't as sharp as they used to be. Names eluded him. Days bled together. He would walk into a room and stand there, puzzled, wondering what he had come for. First, he laughed it off. Age, he thought. Everyone gets a little fuzzy after 60. But deep down, he feared the slow unraveling. His father, Leonard, had suffered a quiet, devastating battle with Alzheimer's, retreating into himself day by day until he no longer recognized his own wife. Harold had watched it all, and though he never spoke of it, the memory clung to him like a shadow. Then, in late January, he met Maria. She wasn't new to Asheville, but Harold had never seen her before that night at the community center during a film screening. She was 62, widowed, bright-eyed with silver-streaked hair and a firm, thoughtful voice. They struck up a conversation after the movie ended, something about how poorly it handled memory loss. And it turned out Maria was a retired cognitive therapist who had worked for over 20 years with seniors struggling with mental decline. Over coffee the next week, she told Harold something he hadn't forgotten since. Your brain wants rhythm, not chaos. You give it peace, intention, and practice, and it'll reward you with clarity. It's not about fixing things after they're broken. It's about keeping the machine running clean. So Harold had asked her what that meant. And Maria had smiled and said, do one thing every night. Just one. Make it yours. Let it be simple, let it be sacred. It's not the habit itself that matters at first. It's the honoring of it. The way you train your brain to expect stillness, reflection, and closure. That night, Harold made his first cup of calming tea and wrote 3 sentences in a notebook. At first, it felt silly. He wasn't sure what to write, but he had promised to try. So he wrote how the cold air had felt on his skin that morning, how he had seen a hawk land on his backyard fence, how he missed the sound of his daughter's voice. 3 sentences. By the end of that week, he noticed something subtle. He was sleeping better. Not longer, but deeper. He wasn't waking up feeling scattered anymore. He'd rise with clarity, make his breakfast, go for a walk, and for the first time in months, feel alert. By the second week, Harold added one small puzzle to his routine. Just 10 minutes. A crossword or a Sudoku or a logic problem from the back of an old newspaper Maria had given him. Not enough to frustrate him, just enough to engage the corners of his mind that retirement had left untouched. He told Maria about it over lunch one day. I'm doing it, he said. Every night. Tea, notebook, puzzle. It's like I'm building something I can't see. You are, Maria told him. You're building the groove. The mind follows what it rehearses. You're rehearsing calm, attention, and memory, night after night. By the end of the month, Harold found himself more present during the day. He remembered small details more quickly. Dates, names, appointments. He began to notice things again. The way light shifted through the oak tree outside, the rhythm of birdsong near the porch, the familiar creak of his favorite chair. It wasn't magic. There was no grand transformation, but there was steadiness, strength, as though his mind had begun to trust him again. One Thursday evening in mid-April, Harold hosted a small group from the community center at his home. They talked about books, played card games, shared stories over roasted vegetables and lentil stew. Near the end of the night, someone asked Harold what he'd been doing to stay so lively lately. Harold smiled. not sure whether to downplay it or lean in. I drink tea and write in a notebook every night, he said. I do a little brain game, and I breathe. That's all. They laughed, but a few people asked him to explain more. And so he did. He talked about Maria, about intention, about the grooves we carve into our brains by repeating the right things, not just reacting to whatever shows up. The next day, Maria called him. You're creating something bigger than yourself, she said. You're showing others it's not too late to choose sharpness, to protect what's still yours. Harold thought about that, protecting what's still yours. It was the first time he had ever seen his mind not as something slowly decaying, but as something he could still shape, like clay that only needed warmth and movement. The nightly ritual evolved in small ways. Sometimes he added a short stretch or a few minutes of meditation. Sometimes he read a poem or wrote down a dream. But he always kept the tea, always kept the 3 sentences, and always 10 minutes of mental play. Weeks turned into months. One summer evening, Harold found himself sitting on a park bench near the lake, watching children race their bikes along the trail while their parents walked behind. The scent of jasmine drifted through the air, mingling with the distant sound of crickets. Maria sat beside him, sipping iced tea, watching the sky turn to gold. You know what's funny? Harold said. I used to think 60 was the start of the end. Like, I had peaked and it was just decline from here. And now I feel like I've finally learned how to live. Like actually live. With awareness. Maria nodded, her smile quiet and knowing. It's never too late to start paying attention, she said. And the moment you do, your life starts to sharpen again. Harold closed his eyes and listened to the breeze. He didn't know how many more years he had. None of us do. But he knew that every night, as long as he could lift the kettle and open that notebook, he would be building something inside himself. Memory, calm, clarity. And in that simple act, done with care and devotion, he wasn't just staying sharp. He was coming alive. And just as the sun dipped below the trees, Maria turned to him and asked, what would happen if more people knew this? If they just tried for 1 week? One night, Harold opened his eyes. Then maybe we wouldn't be afraid of aging anymore, he said. Maybe we'd start looking forward to it. The wind rustled through the trees again, soft and curious, as if waiting for him to continue. And Harold wasn't done talking. Not yet. Maria's question lingered in Harold's mind long after they had left the park and parted ways. That night, as the kettle began its low whistle and the comforting warmth of chamomile filled the kitchen, Harold sat down with his notebook, pen poised but unmoving. Something had shifted. For months now, the ritual had been his own. A quiet, private practice of reclaiming mental sharpness and emotional steadiness. But Maria's words stirred something deeper. What if more people knew? What if this wasn't just about Harold anymore? He looked at the blank page and wrote, maybe clarity is something we pass along. The next morning, he walked to the community center with a new idea forming. On the bulletin board near the entrance, he pinned a small note written in his tidy hand. Evening Clarity Group. Every Thursday, 7 p.m. Learn how a nightly ritual can keep your mind sharp after 60. Tea, puzzles, calm, just bring yourself. Harold. He wasn't sure anyone would show up. But on that first Thursday, 5 people came. On the next, 8. By the end of the month, nearly 20 seniors were gathering in the reading room, seated in a gentle circle, mugs in hand, laughter in the air. They weren't just there for cognitive tricks or brain games. They came because something about the space, the calm, the routine, the shared effort to stay present, felt like nourishment. Each evening began the same way. Pot of tea. A few minutes of shared breathing, then writing 3 sentences. Sometimes they were reflections, memories, hopes. Other times they were just simple observations. The color of the sky, the sound of the rain, the feeling of stillness. And then came the puzzles. Crosswords, logic games, word associations, nothing competitive, just engagement. And in closing, silence. 2 minutes of quiet, together. Harold led it all. Not like a teacher, but like a man walking beside others on the same uncertain trail. He told his story not as a blueprint, but as a beginning. And others followed with their own. Margaret, 71, who had begun forgetting her neighbor's name, now carried a small notebook of daily impressions. Frank, a retired mechanic, once skeptical, now led the logic puzzle rounds with a grin. Lila, soft-spoken and nearly 80, wrote 3 poems in a single week and shared them, hands trembling but eyes alight. One evening, after the group had gone home and the chairs had been tucked back under the tables, Harold lingered by the window, watching the rain bead against the glass. He felt alive in a way that had nothing to do with youth. It wasn't energy or ambition or wild adventure. It was something more grounded, a quiet confidence that he still had something to give, something to discover. Later that night, as he sat once again in his kitchen, pen hovering over the page, he wrote, "I thought aging would be about letting go. But now I know it's about becoming more intentional with what you keep." That sentence stayed with him even into the morning. He found himself thinking about it while grocery shopping, while walking the wooded trail behind his house, while reading the local paper. He began to realize that sharpness wasn't just about memory or focus, it was about meaning. When you had meaning, your mind had a reason to stay alert. The Clarity group grew. Some weeks they met in the park. Other weeks they moved the gathering to the library's larger conference room. Maria helped organize, and a local counselor offered to host a once-a-month Q&A session on brain health and emotional resilience. What had started as a personal routine had become a small movement. And Harold? He remained its quiet pulse. Then, one Thursday in October, Maria didn't show up. She had never missed a gathering before, and Harold felt a ripple of worry the moment he noticed the empty chair. He tried to dismiss it. Perhaps she was simply caught up, or tired, or had forgotten to call. But by Sunday, when he still hadn't heard from her, he walked to her house. A neighbor told him she had fallen. Nothing serious, but enough to keep her in the hospital overnight for observation. Harold visited the next morning. Maria, wrapped in a soft lavender robe, looked smaller in the hospital bed, but smiled the moment she saw him. "You didn't have to come," she said. "Of course I did." They talked for an hour, and when a nurse came to check her vitals, Harold stood to leave. As he reached the door, Maria called after him. "Keep it going, will you? Even if I'm not there." "You know I will," he said. "You started this, after all." "No," she corrected him gently. "You did. I just handed you a match. You built the fire." That night, Harold didn't write 3 sentences. He wrote a full page. About Maria. About the fire. About how the nightly ritual was no longer just a way to stay sharp, but a way to stay connected. To purpose. To people. To something bigger than yourself. He closed the notebook with both hands and held it for a moment, like something sacred. And then he looked up at the ceiling, past the hanging light, as if he could see through it into the sky, the stars, the whole infinite sprawl of life. There were still things he hadn't done. Still people he hadn't met. Still memories waiting to be made, waiting to be honored and preserved. He wasn't done yet, and neither is this story, because there are more evenings ahead. More cups of tea steeping in quiet kitchens. More notebooks opening to blank pages. More names, faces, and moments waiting to be remembered. There's someone out there, maybe in a town like Asheville or maybe in a city across the world, who is just beginning to feel the fog settle in after 60. Someone who thinks the best is behind them. Someone who feels the edges of life growing soft and indistinct. And maybe, just maybe, they'll stumble upon a note on a bulletin board or a video on a screen or a story like this, and they'll decide to begin. Tonight, with 1 cup of tea, 3 sentences, and the quiet belief that it's not too late to stay sharp. Harold stood in front of the mirror that next morning, adjusting his collar in the familiar silence of his kitchen. The steam from his morning tea curled in delicate threads toward the ceiling. For a moment, he just looked at himself. Not with judgment, not with nostalgia, but with a calm curiosity. The man staring back had lines carved deep from time and laughter and loss. But there was still a brightness in his eyes, a steady flicker that had refused to be extinguished. He tucked his notebook into his satchel and stepped outside. The sidewalk was wet from the night's rain. Leaves pasted against the curb like little stained glass windows. The air was cool, scented with the first breath of approaching winter. He walked not with the slow shuffle of someone resigned to age, but with the measured confidence of someone who had decided every step mattered. At the community center, something unexpected awaited him. On the doors, taped carefully in the center, was a poster someone else had made. A photo of their group from last Thursday, laughing, papers and puzzles spread out across the tables. The title above the photo said, "The Clarity Circle, a place to remember who you are." Beneath it, smaller, "Not just for staying sharp, for staying alive in all the ways that count." Harold felt something catch in his chest. Not sadness, not pride exactly either, something deeper, a kind of stillness wrapped in gratitude. The fire he thought he had quietly lit was growing beyond his reach, beyond his name, beyond anything he had expected. That night, the group had nearly doubled. Some brought friends. Others brought their spouses. One woman, May, brought her teenage granddaughter, who sat quietly in the corner, smiling as her grandmother completed her first full logic grid. Laughter filled the room like sunlight through old glass. After everyone left, Harold stayed behind with a man named Ellis, a tall, slow-moving widower who rarely spoke more than a few words each session. That evening, though Ellis lingered, he stood by the window with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the darkened lot. "I didn't think I'd be useful to anyone again," he said softly. Harold turned toward him. "You are Ellis, just by showing up." The older man gave a small nod. "I used to teach high school history, 40 years. But after Doris passed, I stopped teaching everything. Even myself." His voice caught and he cleared his throat. "But this group is the first place I don't feel invisible." Harold nodded. He knew that feeling all too well. "You're not," he said. "Not here. Not ever again." In the weeks that followed, something remarkable unfolded. They began to get letters. Not emails. Not texts. Actual letters. Handwritten, folded, sealed in envelopes. Some were from nearby towns. Some from as far as Oregon and Nova Scotia. Word about the group had spread, and with it, stories from people who had started their own nightly rituals. Some formed their own clarity circles. Others simply wrote to say thank you. One woman, Claire, a 75-year-old widow living alone in Santa Fe, wrote, "I started drinking my tea again. I found my old journals, and I remembered that I used to dream." It was as if the entire generation had been waiting for permission to re-enter their own lives with intention. Harold read every letter, each one carefully. He placed them in a wooden box on the shelf beside the tea tins. That box grew heavy quickly, filled with the weight of rekindled purpose. One afternoon, as snow began to fall lightly outside, Maria returned to the group. She walked in quietly, cane in hand, her eyes scanning the now much larger circle of chairs. People rose to greet her, but she waved them back with a half-smile. Sit, she said. "I'm just glad to be back among the living." Harold pulled a chair beside her. "You were missed," he said. She touched his hand gently. "So were you. Before this." And Harold knew exactly what she meant. They weren't talking about absence anymore. They were talking about the years people drifted. The years people faded into roles that didn't nourish them. The years of being useful to everyone but themselves. They were talking about how easy it was to disappear quietly while still going through the motions of living. But not anymore. A new woman joined that evening. Evelyn, 62. Recently retired from a high-powered job that had defined her for decades. She introduced herself with nervous laughter, but by the end of the evening, she had shared a passage from her private diary, a passage about regret and reinvention. She said, "I thought retirement would be a finish line, but I think it might just be a doorway." That became the new phrase pinned on the wall. Retirement is a doorway. Soon, someone painted it on a canvas. Another crocheted it into a wall hanging. The circle had become more than a gathering. It was now a testament to the idea that even when one chapter closes, the next doesn't have to be smaller, quieter, or less meaningful. In fact, it might be the most important chapter yet. Harold often thought about his first evening walk, about the taste of tea that started it all. He remembered how small it had felt. Just one man, one cup, one notebook. And now Now he looked around the room each week and saw entire worlds waking up again. And the story continues because somewhere out there tonight, another man sits alone with a kettle boiling. Another woman opens a dusty journal. Another soul begins to believe, truly believe, for the first time in years that they are not done. The ritual is spreading. Not because Harold planned it. Not because there's some secret formula. But because meaning, once lit, is a fire eager to catch. So if you're reading this, if your hands are older than they once were, if your days feel like they've grown too quiet, too predictable, too faded, let this be your invitation. You're not invisible. You're not irrelevant. And you're certainly not finished. Tonight, make yourself a cup of tea. Write 3 true sentences. And know that somewhere Harold is doing the same. And so is Maria, and Ellis, and Evelyn, and Claire all the way in Santa Fe. And someone you haven't met yet, but will, because the circle is still growing. And the story has only just begun. On the first snow of December, the Clarity Circle decided to do something different. Instead of meeting in the usual community center reading room, they gathered in Harold's own home, a modest, cozy craftsman house on the edge of town with a wide porch and a fireplace that still worked if you coaxed it long enough. The idea had started as a joke from Maria during one of their Thursday sessions. If we're going to keep growing like this, we'll need a headquarters. Harold, half amused and half curious, offered his living room. It'll be a squeeze, he said, but a warm one. That Thursday evening, they brought casseroles, loaves of homemade bread, tins of cookies, and old family recipes written on yellowing index cards. Felt less like a meeting and more like a homecoming. No one checked their watches. No one hurried. They moved through Harold's house as though they had always belonged there. In the corner of the room stood a small table where people laid out their journals and notebooks, each one filled with entries written night after night. Reflections, questions, confessions, sparks of memory, and hopes still unnamed. Some were neat, some were chaotic. All of them mattered. Harold sat by the fire, listening as Margaret read a poem she had written about her late husband. She read it with her hands folded neatly, her voice trembling but steady. When she finished, no one clapped. There was just a moment of silence, thick with presence. The kind that only comes when everyone is fully there, not in body alone but in spirit too. Ellis, standing beside the fire, said quietly, "That's the first time I've cried in a room full of people and didn't feel ashamed." Someone placed a hand on his shoulder. No words needed. Later, when the fire had died down and most of the group had left, Harold sat with Maria and Evelyn at the kitchen table. They poured the last of the tea, steam curling upward, catching the faint glow of the single pendant light above them. "You know," said Evelyn, "this isn't just a group anymore." Maria raised an eyebrow. "What is it, then?" "It's a sanctuary. A sanctuary for the years no one talks about." Harold didn't respond right away. He thought about that, about the thousands of people he'd met in his earlier years, at church picnics, through work, during volunteer drives. So many of them had disappeared into quiet corners of their homes once they retired. People who once led, taught, built, healed. People whose minds still sparked but had nowhere to burn. And now here they were, reassembling not because of obligation but because of yearning. Because deep inside every person past 60, past 70, past 80, there still lived that same hunger for connection, discovery, and contribution. The next day, Harold walked downtown with a fresh notebook under his arm. Not for himself, this one was for someone else. He stopped at the small bookstore owned by a quiet woman named Nora. She had been at one of the early Clarity Circle meetings but hadn't returned. He remembered her well, soft-spoken, always holding a paperback, always watching but rarely speaking. He found her behind the counter, just opening for the day. "Good morning, Nora." Her eyes lit up with surprise. "Well, if it isn't Mr. Clarity himself." He chuckled. "I brought you something. You don't have to read it now. Just take a look." He handed her the notebook and left without waiting for questions. That evening, she showed up at Harold's door, with cookies, and her own notebook tucked under one arm. "You got me thinking," she said. "I haven't written in 30 years. Thought maybe it was time." By mid-January, the Clarity Circle had expanded into 3 locations: Harold's home, the community center, and the Old Town Library on Tuesdays. Evelyn took charge of the Tuesday Circle. Ellis helped set up the chairs and clean up afterward, even if it meant staying a little late to lock up. Harold found himself needing a new notebook sooner than expected. He had filled the last one with not just reflections but observations about what he was seeing around him. People changing. People lighting up. He noticed how once silent members were now organizing mini-sessions during the week. How Lila, the poet, had printed her first collection and was reading it at a local cafe. How Frank, the former mechanic, had started teaching a beginner's logic class every Saturday morning. These weren't just stories, they were transformations. One evening in February, after the group had dispersed, Harold sat by the window again, notebook open, pen tapping lightly. Outside, the snow had crusted into glittering ice across the sidewalks. Inside, the house was quiet, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet he had known years ago. It wasn't hollow. It was full of memory, movement, and meaning. He began to write, "I used to think age was a narrowing. Now I see it's a widening, like a river that slows and spreads before it meets the sea." And in that moment, he understood something else. They weren't just helping themselves. They were modeling what it meant to live fully into their later years. Not fading quietly, but expanding. Not retreating into silence, but writing the chapters no one had thought to include. They were showing the world that after 60, after 70, after 80, life could still be rich, full of firsts, full of growth. The Clarity Circle became a blueprint for something bigger. Churches began asking Harold to speak. Senior centers in nearby towns reached out for help starting their own groups. Even a few younger adults, children of members, started showing up, notebooks in hand, looking for what their parents had found. Clarity, purpose, ritual, connection. Not just for the old, they said, for anyone who needs to feel awake again. And that's when Harold knew. This wasn't just a group for seniors anymore. This was a movement, and the movement was only beginning. Spring came slowly to Asheville that year. The mountains shed their snow like an old coat, and crocuses pushed through the thawing earth with quiet insistence. Harold could feel it in his bones, the kind of season that reminded you the world wasn't done yet. Trees that had stood bare for months were waking up again, and so were the people around him. The Clarity Circle had taken on a rhythm of its own, humming through the week like a song people kept learning how to sing together. There were now 5 active groups across town, each with its own personality. Evelyn's group met in the early mornings with muffins and birdsong. Ellis, more confident now, ran a Saturday group for men who had never felt comfortable opening up until now. Lila had turned her Thursday evenings into a creative corner where people brought not just notebooks, but paints, photographs, music, and memory boxes. And Harold? He remained the quiet constant in the background, not leading all the time anymore, but guiding, watching, nurturing, like a lighthouse keeping its beam, steady but never loud. One night, as twilight slipped over the porch, Maria came by. She didn't call first. She never did when it mattered. She brought 2 mugs and a worn envelope. "Tea?" Harold asked with a grin already forming. "Always," she said, stepping inside. They sat in the living room, steam curling between them, silence like an old friend at the table. Then Maria slid the envelope across the table toward Harold. "What's this?" "A letter," she said, "from the daughter of one of our members. A woman named Helen. She used to sit in the back, you remember? Wore that navy cardigan every week?" Harold nodded. He remembered Helen. Always on time, always listening but rarely speaking. She had passed quietly 3 weeks ago in her sleep. Maria gestured toward the letter. "Her daughter wanted you to read it." Harold opened the envelope slowly, carefully, as if it might fall apart from the gentleness of its own meaning. The letter read, "Dear Clarity Circle, my mother, Helen, didn't talk much. You probably knew that. But after joining your group, she came home different. Lighter. Not in a loud way, she just moved differently. She smiled more. She made tea every night. She even bought a notebook, which shocked me. I asked her once what she wrote in it. She just said, "I'm remembering who I am." After she passed, I found her journal. It was full every page. Not just reflections but letters to us, her children, her husband, even to her past self. We never knew how much she carried until we read it. And now we do. Thank you for giving her that space. For helping her speak, even if it was on paper. She was not alone. And she left us something we never expected, herself in full color. With love, Anna Thompson. Harold stared at the page long after he finished reading. He felt the weight of it, not sorrow, but reverence. Proof that the quietest lives still echo. He looked at Maria. Her eyes were moist but steady. "We never know, do we?" she said. "No," he replied. "But that doesn't mean it's not working." That evening, they stayed up past midnight. Not talking much, just sitting with the comfort of the fire and the realization that what they'd begun had become something sacred. A place where people found themselves again, where no one was forgotten or reduced to age or silence. As the months passed, a few things changed. The Clarity Circle began sending out monthly journals, made up of member writings, shared anonymously unless someone asked to be named. Those journals traveled across the country. People wrote back, sent poems, sent tea, sent invitations. Harold received a letter from a small village in Ireland where a librarian had started a Clarity group after reading about his. One came from Tokyo, from a retired violinist who had translated the 3-sentence ritual and begun practicing it in the quiet hour before sunrise. One afternoon, walking through town, Harold saw a boy no older than 12 writing in a small notebook while waiting for the bus. When Harold passed, the boy smiled shyly and said, "My grandma writes 3 sentences every night. She says it helps her feel like herself. So I started too." Harold smiled back. "That's a good habit." And he meant it, because the ritual wasn't just about aging. It was about presence, about remembering who you were when the world had convinced you to forget, about speaking softly to yourself in a voice only you could understand. Years passed. Harold grew older, slower. His hands shook a little more, but the tea still brewed every night. The pen still moved, even if the letters took longer. His notebook was now one of many on a shelf, each one marked with a small date, a quiet title, and a note inside that simply said, "Keep going." One summer evening, as the sun dripped like honey over the hills, Harold sat on his porch. He was alone but not lonely. Across town, Clarity circles were gathering. In other cities, in other countries, people were lighting their kettles, opening their journals, settling into the stillness of intentional thought. The world was moving, and he was part of it. He opened a new notebook, its pages fresh and full of promise. "Tonight I saw the wind move through the trees. It reminded me that we don't need to be loud to be alive, and that even at rest we can still move others." He closed the book gently and smiled into the dusk. His story wasn't over, because someone somewhere was just beginning theirs.